Hey, what's up everyone? Miguel Quiles here. In today's video, I'm gonna be critiquing some photos that I received from you guys out there in the audience through my Facebook group. So if you didn't already know this, I have a group on Facebook. It's always linked in the description of my videos, so I always invite you guys to just check out the description of my videos because I have a bunch of links there that hopefully will help you guys in the future. But one of the things that I have linked pretty much in every video is my Facebook group, which is Improve Your Photography with Miguel Quiles. It's pretty basic, right? But Improve Your Photography with Miguel Quiles, if you search for it on Facebook, you'll find the group. And there I asked members to submit photographs, portraits, whatever their best portrait was, send it to me so I could take a look at it and critique it for a YouTube video, which is the video you guys are watching today. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this. A couple of little housekeeping things first before we go into the critiques. I want you all to understand as viewers that first off, it takes a lot of courage to have your photos submitted for critique. Even in private, to have another photographer look at your work and to give you feedback as far as what you did right, what could have been done better, all of those different things, is really intimidating. It's even more intimidating to have your work critiqued publicly. And so kudos to all of the photographers that decided to submit their images. And I want you guys to understand that even though I might be somewhat harsh with some of these photos, I will be fair. I'm not gonna say anything super crazy about these photographs. My goal really, truly is to help you to walk away to be a better photographer. And we all have things that we can do that are better. Even for myself, I critique my photos all the time and I look at them and I say, you know, I could have done this a little bit better. Or maybe if I would have had, you know, this certain set of circumstances, I could have taken a better shot. Some of us are aware of the things that we could do to get better and some of us are not. And so that's where these critiques are very, very useful. So without further ado, let's get right into our first image here. And again, some of these files have the names on it, so I know who it is that submitted them. Some of them don't, but regardless, I'm not going to critique these things any differently based on whether or not I know who the person is, because I don't think that would be really helpful. So let's look at the first image that we have here. It looks like this is a really beautiful black and white portrait. Really, like right out of the gates, the first thing that kind of strikes me is the model's expression. Her eyes are just engaged with the photographer and with the camera. That is the sign and mark of a model that's good at what they do and a model that's comfortable in the situation. And she's doing an awesome job here with her expression. I think the treatment of the photograph was done really well. I'm personally a big fan of black and white photos. I feel like if it was possible to get away with all of my photos being black and white, I probably would do that. But you know, for me, I haven't found a way to make that work. But the black and white treatment in this photograph looks really, really good. So those are some of the good things. Now, in terms of things that I think that could be fixed, there's a couple of things that kind of strike me here. The first one is one that I think I'm going to do a dedicated video on this topic pretty soon, and it's about the watermark. It looks fine. The branding is fine. The logo is fine. It doesn't look like a low quality type of logo. However, what I will say is that generally speaking, I am kind of against putting watermarks on photographs. I guess in this type of situation where you're gonna have your photos shown, you know, on a YouTube channel, it's whatever. But I do think that almost every time it takes away from the photograph. I don't feel like I've ever seen even the most beautiful logo. Like I love my logo. If you haven't seen it, I actually just updated my website, miguelquiles.com, so you can see what my logo looks like. But even for me, I wouldn't put my own logo on my photographs. It never makes it look better. And usually if somebody is so inclined to want to steal your photograph, they're gonna take it regardless. Like this is like a 2-second Photoshop job for me to go in there, do a content aware fill, and that logo is gone. It's like it was never there. So for me, I would rather not put logos in my portraits, or rather not logos, but put watermarks in the portraits because it's very easy to take out. Let me know in the comment section, by the way, how do you guys feel about, your watermarks on your photos? Do you think that it helps? Do you think it takes away? Let me know in the comment section, because I think that's a really good discussion. But watermark is definitely the first thing. The second thing, and this is kind of a weird thing, but if you look at the hand down here at the bottom, I don't know if it's just the weird play of light and shadow, but her hand looks strange to me. It almost looks like she has kind of like I don't know, like a melted demon hand. It's the only way to put it. And I know she doesn't, because you can see her one hand here that looks normal, but because this hand is in shadow and you have this little highlight on the tops of the fingers, the hand just looks off. It looks like maybe it's a rubber hand or something, and I know it's not, but these are things that you have to look for when you take a portrait. You really have to scan the entire real estate of the photograph and figure out what's in the photo. Does it need to be there? And if it needs to be there, is it being shown in the best possible light? And I think for me, the first thing I look at is her eyes. Second thing I notice is that hand down at the bottom. And so this would be something that I would say that if you wanted to go for this type of effect with the lighting, where the light is just on the face, then I would maybe flag some of that light that's hitting her hand so that you don't get any highlights on the hand. Because keep in mind, when you look at a photograph, whatever the brightest parts of the image are, that's where the viewer's eyes are going to go. So just keep that in mind. The other thing too is in terms of the focus, it looks like you got the eyes in focus, which if you saw my last critique video, which at this point was a while ago, I really am a stickler for having eyes sharp and in focus in a portrait. If the eyes were soft, I would tell you right out of the gates, like, I can't even get so far into it because it's out of focus. In this case, fantastic job. The eyes are sharp, they are in focus. The skin treatment, it looks like this was shot, if I look at the settings here, it was 1/25 of a second at f1.4 with an 85mm lens at a ISO of 100. So there's a couple of things here. So the skin to me looks like it's a little bit over retouched. Now, part of this could be that you shot it at 1.4 and it just blurred the skin away anyway. So there's a couple of things, and this is just my personal take on what would make this portrait even better. The first thing being that I would make sure that if I'm using an 85mm or a 50 or whatever focal length it is that you're using, make sure that your shutter speed is double whatever that focal length is. So in this case, you have an 85mm lens. You shot it at 1/25 of a second. I don't know if you were on a tripod. If you were, that's fine. However, if she moves at all, you're gonna end up with a photo that's not as sharp as it would be if you shot it at a higher shutter speed. So I may take this to double 85 as 170. So, you know, I would probably put this at 1/200 just to be safe for my shutter speed. And then I would just dial up my ISO value from 100 to, you know, maybe 320 or 400. And it would give you an exposure that would look very similar to what you have right now, but it would be a lot sharper. So that's the first thing, just a really basic tip. Double your focal length is what your shutter speed typically should be set at. Even if you have a camera that does 5-axis or 5.5-axis in-body stabilization, that's great. All of that helps. But when it comes to portraits, especially when it comes to being shot at f1.4, I would bring that shutter speed up a little bit higher. But beyond that, fantastic photo, great processing, and I would tell you keep going with this. Just be more sensitive and more aware of everything that's in the frame. Let's go to our next photograph here. All right, so this photograph also shot at 85mm. This one was shot at f5, 1/160th of a second, ISO 100. So really a couple of things right out of the gates. I'm a big fan of these like kind of simple color palettes with studio portraits. You have the model or subject that has fantastic skin. Her makeup is done really nicely. Hair looks really interesting. It's on a black background. To me, the color palette is very simple, but it works in this image. My eyes are kind of going to her eyes first because she has those catch lights, which I talk about these in another video. I'll probably just link it in the cards above. But this right here, the reflection of the modifier in the subject's eyes, that makes your viewer go directly to that part. And for me, that's where my eyes are going. I'm looking at her eyes. Then I look at the highlight on her hair. Looks pretty cool. It's kind of a dreamy type of effect. And you're noticing as well that even though we shot this, or the photographer shot this at f5, you notice that it still leads to blur. So this is another thing that I talked about in my shooting wide open versus stopping down video, the differences between shooting at a higher f-stop value versus shooting wide open. And this is kind of a good example of that, where you could see that at f5, you're keeping skin texture in the portrait, but everything else for the most part is falling away. And I think a lot of photographers believe that you have to shoot at f1.4 to do this. And here's an example that you can see that you don't necessarily have to do that. So great lighting, great expression on the model. So kudos to the photographer for not just capturing it, but for looking through all of the photos and deciding that this was a good one. So there's a couple of things here that I would look at to try to improve this photo. The first thing is in terms of the processing. There's, and again, some of this, you have to look at the photograph on your own computer for whoever submitted this, because it could be that the raw file looks different than the JPEG that I'm looking at. But the skin looks like it has a little bit of almost like a chalky type of processing that was done in post. This is something that I would try to avoid when I'm doing skin work. If you shot it at f5, you should have the skin looking pretty good. Only target whatever the imperfections are in the skin. If there's, pimples or caked on makeup or something to that effect, those are the things that you want to kind of target. And the rest of the skin texture, I would advise just leave it alone if it looks good. And to me, it looks like there was some sort of a global, meaning that the whole portrait, the skin was affected completely, because it all has kind of a chalky type of cartoonish type of processing to it, which, if that's the style, that's great. It was well done. But for me, I like to see photos that have a little bit of kind of reality, I think, to them. And so take that for what it's worth. But other than that, I would say in the whites of the eyes, I would probably spend a little bit of time just taking care of these little red lines in the eyes. This is one of the few things where I would say frequency separation does a fantastic job, is in getting rid of those little veins in the eyes. So I would say spend maybe 5 minutes or so just getting rid of those white lines. You don't have to get rid of them completely, but I would say like these two lines here are pretty harsh. I'll zoom back in. This corner of the eye, there's a lot of just webbing, for lack of a better word, that's kind of happening in the corner of the eye. This one's not as bad, but like this line here, I'd take care of this little section here. And yeah, other than that, this looks pretty good. There's a couple of little spots here in the highlighted part of her forehead that I would probably adjust there as well. Other than that, it looks pretty good. These areas that are here on the chest, this is something that either through frequency separation, because it's defocused, or even using dodge and burn, you could actually just take care of those areas. My eyes, as I look at this from where it fits the screen, it looks like there's wrinkles on her chest. And so I would just look to either kind of smooth that out or, dodge and burn it so that your eyes aren't drawn to that. But outside of that, this is a really fantastic portrait, and, kudos to the photographer for the lighting on this, and really just everything else that was done in this photograph. It was really well done. All right, so let's take a look at this one here. This one was shot at f5.6, 50 millimeters, 1/160th of a second, and ISO 200. It looks like a really beautiful studio portrait. Again, really simple color palette, so I'm a huge fan. You've got the gray backdrop, but it's kind of falling off to black a little bit because the lights are, far away from the background, which is kind of cool. She's got kind of the big shirt on. It looks really cool. There's triangles that are happening in this photograph, and if you don't know what I mean, oftentimes when you look at really good poses, you're gonna notice that oftentimes the model will create triangles with their body. So they'll do it kind of putting their hands, which I don't know if you could see that, but they kind of put their hands on their waist, and that kind of creates a triangle there. Or they can do kind of like when they do one of these numbers, they create a triangle here. She's doing it here with her legs, and I think that it works. Like it totally works. Great pose. Zooming in just a little bit here to kind of look at things a little closer. So a couple of quick little tips here. So I think that her hand that's placed on the ground looks like it's contorted a little bit uncomfortably. I think that if you walked up on somebody who was sitting down in this exact pose and this posture out in public, you would probably look at her hand and be like, oh man, that doesn't look super comfortable. Like, why are you posing so hard? So I think in this scenario, the first thing that's kind of drawn to me is like my wrist kind of hurts just looking at her wrist being twisted backwards that way. So I would maybe think to position that wrist a little bit differently, or maybe even try to create some other type of triangular type of pose with her putting that hand on the side of her leg and maybe driving her elbow backwards. I think that would make the pose feel a little bit more comfortable. The other thing too is that her arm in the back here, so you made this triangle and this is great. I think that this arm also could have gone somewhere else. It could have been maybe back on the opposite side of her body. She could have had it going through her hair, doing something a little more motivated than actually just having it laying across her thigh, because that triangle is drawing my eye, and now I see an A because you've got the leg and then you've got this white thing in between her wrist. And so I would say that this probably should not be there. Just kind of have her do something else with it, put her hand in her hair. Anything else would have made this a little bit more interesting, or maybe even have her bring her hand up to her face and maybe she can rest closer to her knee. I don't know what that pose would look like. I'd have to see it, but just picking off stuff off the top of my head. So that's the one thing. The other thing too is this one's okay. This one is all right, but there are some times where you want to look out for the eyes being in the corner of the eye socket. So for example, like if I'm here and I'm looking this way, it tends to create a lot of white area showing in the eye socket. So what I would tell you is maybe having her rotate just the slightest bit would maybe help to alleviate that. But again, in this case, it's not too bad. Had she turned her eyes even more, it would have been a little bit of a problem, but it looks good. The only other thing I would say is that, and again, this could be just because it's a JPEG, but I feel like it's slightly soft. And of course, most people, they're just gonna view the photograph the way that I'm presenting it here on screen. It looks perfectly fine. But when you zoom in, you'll kind of notice it is in focus. It's not, completely lost, but I do think that there was a little bit of detail that was lost here. And it could be, you shot it at 5.6, so you should have some of that texture and detail. I'm willing to bet that it was either something that was done in post-processing, or it's just the compression, potentially a low resolution type of file. But just kind of keep this in mind that when you zoom in like this, and some people might zoom in, like if you post this on Instagram, you could actually pinch the photograph and people can kind of see that texture and that detail. And I would just look to be careful that you're retaining the most texture that you possibly can. In this case, it's not bad, but if I look at, for example, right above her lip and her lips, they don't appear sharp. And the hair kind of has some artifacts in it. And same thing here in the shadow area. It looks almost like maybe grain or something like that was applied to this image in post. So minimize that. And I would say this definitely goes from being a really nice portrait to being like an excellent portrait. Let's go on to the next shot here. And so this photograph was shot at f5, 1/60th of a second, ISO 400 at 33 millimeters. So maybe this was like a 16 to 35 mil lens, or maybe a 2470 lens. Can't tell 100%, but really, obviously, great model, great subject, lips, makeup, everything looks really good. Kind of an interesting tilt to this because you have the background tilted, but then she's also kind of tilted in that same type of direction. So it's kind of an interesting angle. So let's kind of talk about this. So looking at this photo right out of the gates, it looks good. The colors look really interesting. Her expression to me is a little bit like it's almost there. You know, in this sequence of shots, if I was looking through my viewfinder and I saw her giving me this look through the camera, I would be trying to verbally encourage her to continue doing what she's doing and try to kind of give her more confidence that what she's doing is looking really good. And somewhere maybe like 2 or 3 images after this one, she's gonna give you this look that's gonna look super interested, that's dialed in, that's just like an even better expression. I feel like this one is good, but looking at it, I feel like, man, if you just, you know, if you just went a little bit further and just kept motivating and kept encouraging, and who knows, maybe if you look at your images that you shot from this session, maybe she did give it to you and, you know, you saw this one and were like, oh, this is good, which it is a nice portrait. But I would tell you that make sure that you're trying to draw out the best possible expressions. And she almost looks like if I look at this portrait, I want to feel like she's looking at me and she looks interested as a viewer, but it looks like she's looking directly through me. You ever had people that have done that? Like they give you that like million-mile stare where they're not, like, for example, like I'm doing something like this and I'm not really looking at you because my eyes are just kind of wandering off. You don't want that in a portrait. You want them to look engaged and to be locked into that camera. And I don't feel that she has it in this portrait. So that would be the first thing. The tilt, I feel like normally I wouldn't recommend this, but it kind of works here. I don't really mind it. I think it's kind of interesting. When I zoom in here, there's a couple of things. So the photographer shot this at f5, which is great because that normally retains a lot of texture. But as I zoom into this, something has happened. And I don't know if this was a processing thing through Photoshop or through whatever program was used to edit this photo, but it's defocused completely. Her face no longer has the texture and the detail that I would expect to see of an image that's shot at f5. You should be able to, at 33 millimeters, have a portrait that's really sharp. The only thing that I can think of why this portrait might kind of have this characteristic where it looks like it's out of focus is if maybe it was a bigger photo and maybe it was cropped in and the focus still was missed in that scenario. But it's the only thing I can think of, because at f5, her jewelry should be sharp, her eyes should be sharp. Her eyes are on the same focal plane. So if you focus on either of these two eyes, both of them should have been sharp. You should have had some texture in the skin at f5. And for some reason it's missing. And I don't know, let me scan through this photo. I mean, her hair is defocused, which is kind of expected at f5. I mean, it looks like maybe some of her hair is a little bit more in focus. So let me see, dress is still defocused. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So yeah, I mean, looking at a portrait like this, if you are going through your process of selecting your like favorite photos that you're going to post, very first thing that I always recommend is just kind of like zoom into the face and look at the eyes, make sure that they're sharp. In this case, you could see each individual lash, but each one is not super focused. So take that for what it's worth. But other than that, I mean, I think it's kind of an interesting portrait. I think that the thing that's going to take this up a notch, actually, there's one other thing, and that is the makeup. This was something like I probably would not have made this critique a year ago. My eyes weren't developed, I guess, enough to really like pick up on some of the little nuances with makeup. But because I've been shooting beauty for a while, now I start to pay attention to things like, you know, the eyeliner, the lipstick, all those different things. Her lipstick here in this bottom corner of her lip, it looks like it maybe wasn't lined up properly. So if you look at this one, you know, it's kind of like coming to a bit of a point. And then here, I feel like it just kind of drags on a little bit too long here in this area. So maybe kind of like tapering the lip line here would make it look a little bit sharper, because when I see it as a full screen image like this, it looks like she just didn't have the lipstick applied properly in this case. So that would be one thing to basically look at when you're working with somebody. I usually take like 5 to 10, maybe even 15 photos, and I stop. And if I'm on my camera and I'm not tethered, I'll zoom into the photograph and I just kind of scan around. I look at their eyes, look at their eyebrows, anywhere where they would have had makeup applied, which for sure she did her makeup or someone did it for her. So I'd zoom in and just take a look to check the makeup artist's handiwork, because sometimes they do a great job and you're like, great, cool, let's just keep shooting. And then other times, you know, they do things where maybe her expression was causing that area of the lip to kind of look the way that it does. So I would probably advise her against doing one of those where she's pulling her lip, unless the makeup was adjusted to kind of fix that. So other than that, I mean, the exposure is great. Histogram looks really nice and healthy. Great photo. You did a great job with selecting the right shutter speed. Always a big fan when I see photos that are shot at anything other than wide open just for the sake of doing it. So kudos to you for this photo. Let's go to the next one. All right, and here we're looking at f5.6, 1/200, ISO 500, and this is 100 mil. And so before I zoom into this, so a couple of things. So I love just the softness of this photograph. And when I say softness, I don't mean it from a quality perspective, but I just mean from her pose, from her expression, the lighting. There's just a delicateness to how she looks in this frame that just looks really cool. So very good job there. Hair looks great. Makeup was done right. Just looks like a really nice portrait. Let's take a look here at some of the things that we can improve in this photograph. First things first. So anytime that I am photographing somebody and their hands are coming into the frame, this is a secret. Hopefully there's just photographers watching this right now. But if you're photographing somebody and you see that they start to do a lot of like hand stuff where they're bringing their hands into the frame, do yourself a favor, take 2 seconds and take a couple of the photos and then pixel peep their fingernails and just make sure that their fingernails are clean. Or if they had nail polish applied, maybe their nail polish was done like 3 weeks ago, you know, and it's all like painty, like the paint is chipping and doesn't look good. So you want to double check those types of things before you go through an entire set of photos where, you know, they're doing one of these numbers and then all of a sudden you notice like, oh, they didn't have their nails done. It's always going to take away from the photograph. This is a very minor critique, and this is something that you can fix in Photoshop. But the first thing that I noticed, even as a full screen image like this, is that there's, I don't know if she did something to her nail there, what the deal was, if there was just like dirt or whatever, but this is something you definitely want to clean that up in post, because it is the fingernail that's closest to the camera and it is noticeable. The other thing too, which I didn't notice until I zoomed in, this little patch of skin here, I would probably use healing or clone stamp tool and just kind of fix this little spot here. But moving away from that, skin looks kind of interesting, looks good. There's a little bit of a kind of like a saturation issue right here. So if you notice here, this color here is different than basically the rest of the color on the forehead. So there's different ways that you're able to kind of fix or shift the hue and the saturation of this little patch of skin here to match this color. So this would be something that in a portrait like this, I would fix this, because if I look at it from far away, it almost looks like that part of her forehead, like maybe she had a hair curling iron or something and it burned that part of her head. Maybe it did, I don't know, but it's okay, because there's this program called Photoshop that's amazing for everybody that's watching, and you can fix this color here. Maybe that'll be a tutorial for another day too. That's why I love doing critiques, because I get these ideas for tutorials, but this is something that you definitely would want to adjust. Kind of scanning through the rest of the image here. Eyes look cool. They're definitely sharp. They're in focus. You would imagine at 5.6 that it would be. Kind of going through the rest of the image here. Everything else kind of looks really good. I mean, again, you guys notice this is another example where the photographer shot this at 5.6, and you notice that the face is in focus, it's sharp, but then you have this blur and this fall off to the hair, which looks really, really beautiful. The shape of her hair too looks really, really nice. I may potentially, and this is something I don't always do with my photographs, but this would be one where I would use the liquify tool in Photoshop and maybe kind of adjust this shape at the top of her hair. It's a little tiny bit flat, so maybe I would either kind of liquefy the hair here on top to make it a little more, just have a little bit more body and shape to it, or I would take this part of the hair and just kind of give it a little tuck, a little pat, you know, so that you get a little bit of a better, like a nicer shape to the hair. But yeah, other than that, I mean, I think this is a really cool portrait. I really love the lighting on this. I think it's super well done. Again, just the softness. I'm sure that she was super happy with this photograph. So well done to the photographer. Let's go to this next shot here. And, you know, this is another very interesting shot. We have shot here at f5.6, 1/1000th of a second, 100 millimeter, ISO 100. So a couple of things. Obviously, the first thing that's going to jump out at me in this shot is the color. Holy cow, for vibrance and color. It just pops, even here on my screen. It's just like a very poppy image with the blues and greens, yellows, oranges. I'm a big fan of that. I like that she has her nails done, at least. I mean, I haven't zoomed into it, but I do like that her nails look like they've been kept up. Her expression is great. I love the windswept hair that's happening here. And let's kind of zoom in here. Let's do a little inspection. I didn't really notice this actually. Now that I zoom in, I kind of see it when I back out. She's got this little blue makeup here, or teal, whatever color that is, in the corner of her eyes. It's kind of an interesting choice for the colors of the makeup. And yeah, so there's a couple of little things that I'm noticing, and it looks like this was off-camera flash, maybe with a silver or white umbrella of some sort. Looks like maybe there's a wall. There's something in the background there too, which is good. And that kind of gives that even type of lighting that you're getting on the face here. So there's a couple of things you're gonna notice here, and these are, again, beautiful portrait. These are all just things that if I take a photo like this and I'm totally in love with it, I'm gonna zoom in and I'm gonna start nitpicking stuff because I wanna make it as good as it could possibly be before I have to go. Because this field is like magic. Like, you need to be shooting at this field all the time. But first things first, so if you look in the shadow areas of the skin here, you're gonna notice that there's a lot of saturation. On my screen, it's orange. Probably, you know, this area here would be kind of expected because you have this orange flower here next to her, and maybe the light hits off of that and it casts this like orange hue into the shadows. However, let's zoom back out. It looks like maybe there's some in front as well because it's out of focus. So what's happening is, because the light is so broad, it hits these surfaces and then it reflects that light back into the shadows, but it's not reflecting a kind of like a pure color of light or a neutral color of light. it starts to pick up whatever color it is that it's bouncing off of, and it just throws it back onto their face. And in this case, she has this orange and like red that is being cast back into the shadows of her face. And so this is something that's relatively easy to fix. What I would end up doing is have like a white surface. You could use a towel or a blanket or whatever. When you're shooting in a field like this, just have that white surface out in front of them so that when the light hits that surface, let's say you're taking that same photo, instead of it reflecting that orange hue into the neck and onto the chin, it's just gonna be just like regular neutral colored light, which I think will play much, much better to the rest of the skin tones on the face. But honestly, I mean, that's like a pretty small nitpick. I love the colors on this. I also think that maybe, in this case, it doesn't bother me too much that she's in the center of the frame, but I would even maybe consider having her, let me see if I can put this up here. So if you see the rule of thirds grid here, you have her directly in the center. You have the top grid line kind of intersecting with the eyes, which is great. I do that all the time. I love it. But I would probably take this photo and just shift it just the slightest bit to the left, since her hair is kind of moving with the wind here. Just have her just, you know, or even for you, just kind of take the frame and just go this way so that she will be positioned in this quadrant of the photograph. And you know, it's very small little things. This is a really great photograph, but I do think that if you make those small adjustments, you'll take it up to that next level. Really good job. All right, so let's take a look at this photo. I'm a huge fan of these almost like editorial type of portraits. I feel like this is something I would see in a magazine, like he's some kind of like master at whatever craft it is that he happens to be working on. He looks like somebody who really just kind of enjoys what he does, whatever it is that he does. Maybe we could tell. Let me see if I zoom in here. Okay, music instrument service. So perhaps he's working on fixing guitars or something. I don't know. But it looks like from his expression, like he really is a happy guy and he enjoys doing that. Great job on the lighting overall. He has a really beautiful quality of light on him. Something that I feel like is a lost art and kind of a very subtle thing is that he has this hair light that's really just beautiful. You have this nice separation from your subject to the background. Oftentimes people try to create that dimensionality in their photo by just defocusing the background. And while that's not wrong, what makes it even better and more refined is if you could take a hair light and add that to the frame, or maybe something behind them is creating that little bit of a hair light, and it tends to separate them and it makes them pop a little bit more from the subject that they find themselves in. So really good job on that. So let's kind of talk about a couple other things that I would think to improve in this. To me, like I was saying in the beginning, oh, by the way, f2.8, 50 millimeters, 1/250th of a second, and the ISO was at 250. So exposure-wise, looking at the histogram, spot on, looks great. Skin tones look nice. The thing for me in an editorial portrait, I wish that it was driven home a little bit better that he works doing like musical type of repairs. So rather than him maybe holding, let's see, I mean, I can't even really tell at all what this is. It just looks like an apron. So I would have, or a bag maybe, I don't know. But if he works on musical instruments, I would probably have him holding a musical instrument that he's working on, or something that kind of drives that story home a little bit more. I feel like that's the only thing that is missing in this photograph is that story component to the portrait where, yeah, he's working on an instrument and clearly he's in some kind of a work environment or in a, you know, he's got all of his stuff in the background. Like he's clearly working on things. You know, he's got work attire on. So what is he working on? And I feel like there's a little bit of mystery in that. If, say, his arm would have been covering that even more, I would have no idea. He could be a mechanic. He could be anybody, you know? So I would say rather than him holding on to whatever it is that he's holding on to, have him hold on to a violin or a guitar or something, you know, that just kind of sells the fact that this man is somebody who works on stuff, right? Beyond that, if I zoom into the photograph, it is a little tiny bit over sharpened. If you look at the hairs on his head and you look at his skin, it's either really highly sharpened or there's a lot of clarity that's been added to the photograph. You kind of see it in his beard and his mustache and his goatee. They just look really, really sharp. So I would probably aim to reduce the clarity or the sharpness that was added to this photograph. But yeah, other than that, I mean, man, this is a really beautiful portrait. Thank you for submitting this one. Love this one a lot. Just a couple of little tweaks here and there that would really just take this up to another level. One last thing too, this bottom corner here, I don't know what this paper is, but if you look at the photograph, I feel like this is out of place. So maybe just, again, like I told the first photograph who shot that one, look in the entire frame. Everything needs to serve a purpose. If it doesn't serve a purpose, get rid of it. Like, this is a scene where hopefully you had the ability, it looks like you set up your lighting and all that. Go into this, you see the frame, the little paper down there, just pull it out. Take the same photograph again. That would take this from like a 8 out of 10 to like a 9.5 out of 10, just making those few adjustments, because this one's really well done. All right, so let's take a look at this next photograph. A lot of 85mm focal length shots, pretty cool. So 85mm, f1.8, 1/200th of a second, and ISO 250 are our settings. First and foremost, looking at him, he's got a solid expression. Great beard too. Man, like, I'm a huge fan of taking these dramatic style portraits of people with beards. I don't know why, but I feel like it just adds this character to portraits that you usually don't see as much. So really good job. Subject did a great job with his expression. His eyes look amazing in this shot. And I do love how you have the green eyes and then you have the background kind of almost as like it's got a little splash of that same type of color. I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but I do like that because it does add a little bit of dimensionality. He does have dark colored hair. So sometimes without that splash of color in the background, his hair is just gonna blend into the background. It'll just be like a floating face. We don't wanna do that. Didn't happen in this photograph, mostly. So very, very good job there. Looking into this photo, zooming in just a little bit. So let's talk about this. So I was talking about that dimensionality. We do have that splash of light here. And if I zoom in, I could see, like here along the edges, you see that green splash kind of hitting here, but the top of his head, because his hair is really dark, is just kind of fading into the background. Same type of thing here, his beard and his shirt, you can't really see where one starts and the other one ends. So, you know, this would be something where maybe in post-production you might, like, let me see, if I bring up the shadows, you could see the detail is there because you could see that separation. And this is on a JPEG, so on a RAW file, you know, you could do quite a bit more. But maybe I would mask in some of this area here on the top just to bring out that detail. And same thing, just kind of mask this area here, just so that you could see that kind of definition and that difference between the beard and the shirt and the top of the head. Let's reset that. The other thing here too is that this is another kind of an example where if you're shooting at f1.8, you want to make sure that as much as possible, and I'm not saying this is like a hard and fast rule, because people break it all the time, and I've broken it myself. But generally speaking, I try to get both eyes to be sharp and in focus as much as possible. I feel like this shot would kind of benefit from having both eyes really sharp and in focus because he has such a like solid expression, piercing the camera with his eyes, but just with one eye, because one of them is relatively sharp. It's still a little bit defocused. Like if you look in the iris here, you'll see that you don't see the type of clarity and detail. So it looks like maybe the focus was missed. It looked like it hit the eyebrows a little bit more than it hit the eyes. And it's really hard to get the eyes in focus at f1.8. Like it takes a little bit of work. This eye is completely out of focus. So this would be a scenario where this portrait have the nose looking directly at the lens. Both eyes will be parallel. You could focus on either eye and both of them will be in focus. In this case, one was and the other one wasn't. And I say that loosely because this one technically wasn't even in focus either. It was so shallow at f1.8 that you kind of missed it. And other than that, I mean, I would probably spend a little time on this patch of skin right here, just kind of retouching some of these bigger pores that you see on the face, and maybe some of the blemishes and stuff on the nose. But other than that, I mean, this is a really cool portrait. You know, maybe even cleaning up a little bit of the eyebrows and these like hairs that are coming down from his bangs. Just very quick and simple things in Photoshop that you can fix, but what you can't fix is that out of focus eyeball. So again, every photograph that you take, if you see that you're doing something that you really like, zoom into the eyes and just make sure they're in focus. And the easiest way to fix it, have them face the camera with their nose, and both eyes should be in focus no matter which one it is that you pick. So beyond that, beautiful job, great color processing. Just bring up those shadows a little tiny bit maybe and mask it. If you like the overall contrast of the photograph, maybe just bring up the shadows and then just mask in the top of the head and the collar area, and you've got a really, really good portrait here. Let's go to this next one here. All right, so this was at f1.8, 1/200th of a second on an 85 mil and ISO 100. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that's happening here. Model looks great. I love the effect that's being created by her leaning on whatever that is. I don't know if it's like a wall or window or what it is, but that double, that reflection effect is really cool. Color looks really nice overall. You've got some nice complementary tones with the green in the background, the yellow football bokeh that's in the background, blue eyes, red lips. Like the color palette that was chosen for this looks really cool. The 50-50 nature of this image, like if I put the rule of thirds here, you notice how her eyes are intersecting on both of these points for the most part, like it's in that vicinity. So this is like really nice composition that was chosen by the photographer. So let's talk about some things that we could do to improve this shot. First and foremost, her expression looks good. This is gonna sound weird, but I feel like her expression looks a little bit better in the reflection than it does in the actual photograph here on the right, like her real side of the photo. Her expression to me looks okay, but it looks better to me in the reflection. So that's weird. Yeah, that's really weird. I don't even know what to say about that. Work on the expression, like work to kind of talk to the model, get them to feel comfortable. And again, if she's doing a good job, which she's in the zone right here, keep talking to her and keep motivating her. That looks beautiful, that looks wonderful. Tilt your head this way. Give me something a little bit stronger. Just keep talking to them and keep them thinking and working through poses and expressions. And I feel like this could have been just sharpened just a tiny bit more, and you'd have a photograph that would be that scroll stopping portrait that I always try to harp on for people to create. And it would be right there. The other thing too, kind of looking at the saturation here on the cheeks. I don't know if the model kind of just did her own makeup. It's fine if they do. Oftentimes we don't have makeup artists that, you know, could come in and take care of people for us. We usually, you know, if you're doing a last minute shoot or a test or whatever the case might be, they often do their own makeup, and overall her makeup looks really good, but there could be a little bit more definition to the makeup here on her cheek because I feel like it's kind of blotchy. She also has a little bit of redness here on the tip of her nose that kind of stands out from the rest of the tones that you see around her nose. So this is something in Photoshop that you could easily fix. This is also something in Photoshop you could also adjust. There's a lot of just different color or different shades of red tones that are in the face. Even if you're just looking at this area of her skin, you have a different tone here compared to here, compared to here, compared to here, compared to here. Like there's just a lot of different hues of red. So I would try to go into Photoshop and play with your hue saturation across the skin and basically just make it to where it's a little more uniform. This would take a little bit of work because it's not like you have half the face that's like perfectly one hue and the other one that's perfectly a different hue and you just need to get them to match. It's in spots, so you have to go in there and you have to adjust that. The only other thing too is maybe just spending a little bit of time here, just kind of cleaning up the skin right underneath the lip and this little spot here on the lip, and maybe around the nose. So just take a little bit of time. You know, you could do this with a blank layer healing brush and just kind of pick up these little spots and just do some quick cleanup. But eyes are sharp and in focus. It's got this beautiful, rich color and tone to it. Props to the photographer, props to the model. Really, really nicely done shot. All right, before we continue on, I want to take a moment to let you guys know and remind you, I've had a lot of people that have been asking me in my last few tutorials that I've posted, how do I retouch my photos? How do I color grade my photos? How do you pick your photos? Like, how do you know out of a, 500 or 600 photos that you might take, how do you pick a photo? Like how do you pick which ones are the best ones? How do you light your subjects? Why do you choose the lights that you use? Like I read some of these comments and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many videos I would have to make to be able to answer these questions. And I did exactly that. A few years ago, I created a tutorial called Dramatic Portraiture 101 that kind of goes into the process that I go through to create my dramatic portraits. So in this tutorial, you're gonna see 4 different photo shoots. You have male and female models. And I'm showing you exactly why I chose the gear that I used, why I lit them the way that I lit them. You see everything in terms of the hows and the whys of the actual photo shoot and the creation of the image itself. But then the cool part is, for each of those 4 photo shoots, I show you afterwards how I go about selecting the photographs and how I go about retouching those photographs. And because I know everybody has a different way of doing that, some of them will actually just show a super basic way of doing it in a program called Alien Skin Exposure, which I love to use. So really simple process doing that. One of them will show you because I know there's a lot of Lightroom users out there. So one of them shows you how you can do some post-processing using Lightroom and then bringing it into Photoshop. And then there's also my full retouch, which takes you from Capture One to Photoshop to Alien Skin. So you see kind of an easy, intermediate, and then a more advanced way of not just color grading, but also retouching skin, retouching hair, the whole thing, like the whole process from start to finish. I also included in the tutorial how to market your headshots, the differences between using high-speed sync versus ND filters for getting this dramatic portrait look is what I call it, along with a lot more. There's just like tons in this tutorial. As a matter of fact, there's more than 7 hours worth of content that I put together in this. Now, this tutorial usually sells on my website for $299, and it's been on sale for a couple of years at that price. If you ever get the chance to come to one of my workshops in person, you probably already know that I usually have the tutorial available and it's at 50% off. So you can get the tutorial for $150 if you come to see me in person. However, for a limited time, and maybe by the time you're watching this tutorial, or this critique rather, if it's like several years down the road, maybe the price might be different. But as of right now, the lowest price that I've ever offered this tutorial for, it's on sale right now for $89. 7+ hours of content. It's available via digital download. So check the description for this video. I'll have a link out there for it. And if you've ever wondered how I do what I do, get the tutorial. It's super useful. It took us almost 6 months to film all of the content that we have for that video. And so we've had great feedback coming back from it over the years, and I really do think that it will help you out a ton. So if you're interested in kind of taking your portrait game to the next level, Dramatic Portraiture 101, $89 only. Check the description for more details. Anyway, let's get back into this photo. I'm gonna take a sip for the working man. Okay, so looking at this photograph here, it was shot at f8, 1/125th of a second, 85 mil, ISO 125. First and foremost, again, I kind of talk about this quite a bit with these portraits, but I love the color palette. You have the yellow background, nice vibrant color. You have the blue sweater, shirt, whatever it is that she has on, looks really cool. You even have this like little red, whatever. I don't know if it's like trim for the shirt or if it's a cord of some sort. All of this, all complementary colors, and it all looks really beautiful. Her expression looks great. I talk about this in my posing hands video, but you notice how she's holding her hair and you see the blades of her hands. She's not showing the backside of her hand. So beautiful job by both the photographer who saw this and was like, wow, this is great, I wanna submit this. And also for the model to have that awareness that she wants to show the blades. So really beautiful. Zooming into the photograph here, and this is actually a little too much zoom. Let's go 1:1. All right, so going into the photograph here, you have a pretty good amount of detail because it's shot at f8. So you got a lot of texture all throughout the image, in the hair, skin. Yeah, everything looks good. You notice how at f8 you see the jewelry. It's still, you know, sharp. Yeah, skin tones here, everything looks really good. So there's a couple of quick things. The first thing being that I would probably dial the highlights down just a pinch. And I'm talking like, for example, I'm gonna try to do it on this JPEG. It may not work, but just bringing the highlights down just a pinch. Maybe that's a little too much. Maybe like 19. Let's do before and after here. So just bringing the highlights down just a little bit, because I do feel like this center area of her face is just the slightest bit overexposed. And actually, if you look at your histogram here and you see your reds, you have that really high peak. It's just the slightest bit overexposed on the face. So this could be something where you feather the light a little bit, or just in post-production, just drop the highlights a touch and you've got a really nice exposure. The other thing is just kind of spend a little bit of time just doing a little bit of a quick cleanup on the skin. This is honestly because you lit the photograph properly, you're gonna have an easier time retouching the portrait. And this is what I try to explain. I talk about this in dramatic portraiture, but when you light your subjects correctly, the end result of that should be that you have less work to do in post-production. So you'll oftentimes, like for me, whenever I post a portrait online, people will say like, oh, how did you retouch that photograph? And retouching is a part of the process, but you'll find that the more important part of the process is making sure that you lit your subject properly, because good light is going to take care of a lot of imperfections. Bad light is going to make those imperfections more noticeable, and then you're gonna have to do more lifting in post-production, and it's not fun. So this one was one where you lit it so nicely that these little blemishes will be like the quickest thing to fix up. And you're only gonna target just those areas that have any type of blemish, which she has relatively good skin, so you really won't have that much work to do. But you know, I would definitely take care of some of those little areas of the skin to kind of make this portrait a little bit nicer. The white part of her eyes look great. This is also another thing where like her eyes, I would maybe rotate her a little bit more towards the camera as she's kind of doing this pose. You know, these are very slight critiques, but I still think overall, beautiful subject, beautiful colors, you know, very lightly retouched, which I am a fan of. But, you know, just kind of hit those different spots here, just really quick with a healing brush or a clone stamp tool. And I think it will just add a little bit of extra pizzazz to your portrait. So let's go to the next one. And here we have one at f10, 1/160th of a second, 85 mil, ISO 100. This is like classic portraiture right here. You know, you've got that like, it almost looks like it could be a seamless paper background, maybe with a little bit of like a wrinkled texture to it. So kind of dig the background. She has awesome hair. Like I'm a huge fan. Anytime I can get a model that has, or a subject that has hair that just looks different than what you would usually see. Like this is like a photographer, especially a portrait photographer's dream, because you just end up getting these like super interesting portraits. Great lighting overall, like there's a nice quality of light that's being used here. I do like the fact that she has black on and then you have a lighter colored background. This is something that when I first started, I might have shot her on a black background and then it wouldn't have come out like this. So good job having the light background and then having the dark clothing and seeing that, you know, it creates a little bit of contrast, which is great. Let's talk about some of the things to adjust. So first thing for me is her hand. She is showing the blade of the hand. So technically that's cool. That's great. It doesn't look bad. However, I would prefer to see this side of the hand than to see the inside of the hand, because there's two things that her kind of posture, I guess, is kind of telling me. The first one is that she almost looks like she's a little bit uncomfortable, kind of like how, you know, if you're doing one of these numbers, like that's almost what I'm seeing in the pose, is that she's like, oh, I don't know, you know, like you just asked her a question and she's just like a little bit confused. And that tends to happen when you have this type of posture in the photograph versus if you have one of these types of postures. It's more thoughtful, it's more interesting. You know, she can, I'm just doing the worst impression of this, but models will do it a lot better. But just kind of like being thoughtful and thinking. And usually that's being done with this side of the hand. This side tends to be a little more like, oh, I don't know, I'm not quite sure. The other thing too is it looks like she might be getting ready to just like pimp slap something because she's showing the backside of the hand. So I always tell people karate chop the camera, and that's how you know that you've got the blades and this looks soft and beautiful. This looks kind of aggressive to where like it's just bap, like get out of my face. I say crazy things, what could I say? But you know, it looks a little aggressive, but truly it looks like she's just a little bit uncomfortable just because she's kind of scratching. So I would adjust that. The other thing too is kind of zooming in here. Let's go 3:1 on this one. It looks like you slightly missed focus here, which I don't know if it was that you missed the focus or maybe depending on the lens that you used, you started to get a little bit of diffraction where you shot it at f10 and theoretically you should have like tons of depth of field. You should have a really sharp image, but it looks like maybe potentially because the lens that you used wasn't, you know, like if you use a really high-end lens, you could shoot at f10 and you don't really have to worry about diffraction. But if you shoot with, let's say like a kit lens, or you shoot with some of the like lower priced lenses that are out there and you try shooting at f10, I mean, diffraction is going to be a little bit of an issue. And I think maybe that's what happened here. Because at f10, I feel like you're losing a little bit of detail in the skin. It looks like the eyes are not sharp and in focus, and that's something that you should have, especially for a tight portrait like this, like a tightly cropped and composition portrait. That's something to look out for. But other than that, I mean, her makeup is spot on. Everything looks really good there. Her skin processing isn't, you know, over the top. Yeah, I see what she's doing now. So she's kind of like pulling up the turtleneck, which is kind of cool. So yeah, I mean, she could still do that and just have it here. So she could do kind of like one of those numbers versus one of these numbers. This feels awkward. Even if, try it out. Like if you're watching the video right now, just try doing this. It probably feels a little awkward, but yeah, other than that, it looks good. You know, again, with the watermark, like I was saying earlier, you know, the watermark, the logo itself looks clean. I don't know that it's adding anything to the image, so conversation for another day, but definitely this would be something that if I posted this online or posted it in my portfolio, I wouldn't have the watermark on there. But other than that, really great image, great lighting, like bravo on the lighting because it was very well done. Let's look at the next shot here. And so a couple of things. First and foremost, we have this shot at f4. 1/320th of a second, 70 mil, ISO 64. Very interesting choice. We have this gentleman here, well lit, with his hat. Looks interesting. Looks like a really interesting dude. Like, I'm sure this guy has some stories to tell. Really nice. If I zoom in here, looks like it's, for the most part, it's pretty sharp. It looks like it might be a touch over sharpened, just a little bit, just kind of looking at the highlights on his face. They look a little crispy. So maybe there's some clarity or something that's being added to this photograph. I would maybe just dial it back just a pinch. I mean, it's not over the top. I don't think anybody would be like offended by the amount of clarity and sharpness, but this would be one where like it's just a little tiny bit overboard. Yeah, so I would bring that back a little bit. The other thing too on the hair, this is something I look out for with black materials, whether it's a hat or a shirt or jacket or whatever. Lint picks up really easily. It doesn't matter what camera you have. God forbid you have like a really high res camera. You see every little lint and hair and fuzz and everything else on the fabric. So usually if I have somebody wearing a dark colored jacket or shirt or whatever, before I even start working on the skin, the first thing that I do is create a blank layer in Photoshop, and I just go with my clone stamp tool and I just get rid of all of those little hairs and fuzz and everything else. And sometimes just doing that by itself takes that photo up a notch and it ends up looking quite a bit better. So this is one where I'd spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes and just kind of clean up those areas. You know, he's got a couple of spots here. It looks like you tried to do that here on the jacket. You might want to adjust the hardness of the brush that you're using, because you notice how the way that I could tell, you see the material and then you kind of see this like perfect circle right here. And that's usually the brush being too hard. So if you go into your brush settings and just kind of adjust the hardness of your brush, it won't have such a defined edge line when you sample. So kind of going through the rest of this image here. Yeah, everything else looks really good. The only other thing I would say is his expression. It looks like one of those in-between expressions. So what I mean by that is like when you're taking portraits and you're working with someone who's not a model, who's used to just like dialing it in every single shot, they're like 100% engaged. When you're working with regular, everyday folks, they just kind of stare at the camera and they just kind of wait for you to tell them to do something. And sometimes you'll tell them to pose or look a certain way and they just kind of like give it to you one time and then they're just like looking around and they're off in some other headspace. So this is one where I feel like it was kind of an in-between type of pose. Like maybe you were conversing with them and he started to say something and you just kind of caught or captured that shot. So just work with the expressions. This is one, like he looks like a really cool dude, like with his jacket and his hat. I would go back to the video that I created a few months ago, I guess at this point. It was earlier this year. That was the one easy trick to pose anyone. It's here on my channel. Watch that video, because this would be one, like I would love to photograph this man. He looks super interesting. And I feel like if you get him to play a little bit of a character, based on the attire, based on his personality, you might get a better expression from him. This one looks okay. It's an acceptable expression, but I do feel like it could be better with that. And again, I already talked about the watermarks. The only thing about the watermark on this one that kind of gets me is that if you see the fabric here, this was shot at f4, so maybe it's just the depth of field that is starting to blur away the fabric here. But it looks like there's some like, I don't know, vibration or something that's happening, because you're not getting like really good texture and detail in this bottom area. And so what's happening is, because you have your watermark here, my eye goes down there to check it out, and then I see this fabric texture and it's not like 100% sharp. So, you know, again, this is where I say like sometimes the watermark takes away from the image, like most of the time it does. If I'm gonna put a watermark on the photograph, I'd rather put it in a place that's not, like there's nothing there. So this might be weird, but maybe taking this watermark and maybe putting it in this like dark area might be better, like really small, or just not having it at all. I mean, that's just, I don't know. Fight about this in the comment section below, but I do feel like that area down there, I don't know if it was camera shake or what it was, but all of these things, put it together because your lighting is excellent. It's very well done. Just an easy, like this is like a great portrait. I don't know how else to put it. So make those adjustments to it and you've got a better shot. Okay, looking at this one here. So first and foremost, like styling is on point. Again, love the hair. I love the glasses. I don't know if those shades are tinted. Let's see. Yeah, that's interesting. So it's not the shades. It looks like they're clear and she just has some makeup or something. I like that. That's cool. I do like the red background, this brick wall, with the simple colors of her attire, with her hair. Retouching here was really nice, looking at it from far away, and we'll zoom in here to take a look at it. This was shot at 30 millimeters, f2.8, 1/800th of a second at ISO 100. Histogram looks pretty good. A little bit shifted to the left, meaning that there's some pretty good shadows, but I feel like the highlights in this shot are where they should be, which is on the face. My eyes are immediately drawn into her face. But let's talk about where the eyes go after that and maybe some things to keep in mind for a portrait like this in the future. So when I look at this portrait, she's being lit, it looks like by a softbox of some sort, which is why you're getting that nice pop of light on the skin, and you've got a little bit of a highlight on the shoulder. Looks cool. This here, hold on, sorry. There we go. All right. So this area down here, this little green leafy stuff, I would get rid of this in post. I don't know if maybe this was a spot, because I do see that, you know, you've got this like dual texture on the wall. So maybe you wanted to shoot on that wall so that you can have both of those textures. I don't know, maybe you could take whatever that is, maybe it's a potted plant or something, and you could push it out of the way. Because I do feel like with this color palette, if that background was just like a solid color going all the way down, it would be like, it would be really good. It's still really good, but it would be even better. Kind of zooming into this shot here and looking at the post-processing, the first thing that kind of jumps out at me is that it is a little tiny bit over-sharpened. And you can kind of tell that when you look at the hairs. Her curly hair just looks very, very sharp. So that's something you want to look at. I mentioned this in the prior photograph that when you have somebody wearing dark colors, you definitely want to look looks like this is part of the styling of this top. It's got like glitter or something, which is fine. But just make sure that you're looking at that. If it's not supposed to be glitter, like this right here, 2 seconds, clone stamp or healing brush, and just kind of fix those little areas. Yeah, and the only other thing I would say is like on the skin on her face, there's some strange stuff that's happening here with the processing, and that could be the over sharpening. It looks like maybe there was some like smoothing effect that was added to the skin. She has really good makeup on from what I could tell, so what I would say is maybe dial back a little bit on the smoothing and definitely dial back on the sharpening, because this area right here that's lining her face with her hair is just the slightest bit over sharpened. The only other thing too is the pose. She has the back side of her hand showing to the camera, and in this case, you know, this is a minor nitpick. Most people won't notice it, but when you notice it as a photographer, you can't unsee these things. But people of whoever it is, women, men, whatever, they usually have a lot of vascularity on the backside of their hands where you can see the veins and all of that. This is why I talk about showing blades of hands. So if anything, with a pose like this, you want to try to get them to not show the back of the hands if at all possible, and not to show the insides of the hands. That's what we talk about in the tips for posing hands video, which is I think maybe 2 videos back from this one. But yeah, I mean, other than that, these are all like little simple tips. I think it's a beautiful photograph, and I think with these few adjustments, again, you might go from like an 8.9 to like a 9.9 killer photo. So really nicely done. Take another sip here as I scan this photo. Okay, so on this photograph, 100mm, f5.6, 1/320th of a second, ISO 200. Settings look great. Surprisingly, the histogram to me, if I just saw the histogram, I'd be like, ooh, I wonder what this shot looks like. And then when I see it, the exposure is spot on. Like technically, settings-wise, the exposure looks really nice. Red hair, blue eyes with a soft pink type of lipstick. Excellent choice. I don't know if she picked the makeup or you had a makeup artist or what the deal was, but this combination of colors really, really works well. The pose works well. The head tilt, the depth of field, everything here I think makes for like a really intriguing photograph. Her expression is one of those that captures you as a viewer, which that's worth its weight in gold when you're taking these types of portraits. If we're looking at things that we want to improve on, the first thing is that it appears to me like maybe the eyes might be a tiny bit soft. And this is at 5.6, so it shouldn't be. But you have really good texture on the skin, but I almost feel like there's either like a motion blur or there's just something here to the eyes that's making them less sharp than what they could be. She's got beautiful eyes, and I feel like if they were a little more, they were a little sharper and more detailed and more in focus, that it would just like, it already grabs the viewer, but it would really just like grab them and just smack them around with just amazingness, right? And that's what I try to do when I'm taking a portrait close up where you're filling the frame. The eyes, they have to hold on to somebody. And if they're super sharp and you can see all the little like universe flakes that are going on inside of their eye, that tends to make people really just stop and just awe and wonder looking at your portrait. It's almost there, and she has the eyes to pull that off, but you have to make sure that they're super sharp for that. Skin treatment looks really good. There's a couple of little spots here that I would say that you might want to play with the saturation of the skin, because she's got some pink spots here on the skin. These are things that I talk about in Dramatic Portraiture 101, like same thing here on the cheek. So these are all areas that you might want to target. And then you do have some green that's starting to be kind of introduced here into the chin area. And I don't know if that's just like veins. Again, some people when they're cold, like their skin changes colors and you can kind of see the veins and stuff. This is something that you could easily fix in Photoshop. It's a very quick fix. She's got a little bit on her neck here. So yeah, these are things that really briefly you can go into Photoshop and kind of make these adjustments. But other than that, I mean, this is a really beautifully done portrait. The only other thing I would say too is the fingers. I almost would prefer to have this photo shifted a little more so that you could see more of the hand and the hair. Because right now, like I know that they're hands because I've taken portraits, but because her hands are kind of bent like this, it looks like some people could argue that there's not enough of the hand showing to know that it's a hand. So it could just be like, who knows? Like, I don't know what it could be. Again, being very nitpicky, but maybe just move that composition over the slightest bit so that you could see part of the arm and you could see a little more of the hand to see that that's kind of what's happening, and you should be good to go. But really, really beautiful portrait. I like that. Okay, so let's talk about this one. So this is kind of interesting. Doing these types of like fitnessy type of photos, it can be really, really hard to come up with something that is unique in this genre of portrait. And I like this. Like, I like the creativity behind this photo where you kind of see her back and it's almost like the perspective is just sliding right into this side of the frame here where you could see that she's there waiting and she's got a great expression. She's got a great pose. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening here. So let's kind of talk about this. So from a composition perspective, Very well crafted, very well done. There's something that's happening with this photograph, and this was shot at f1.4, 1/160th of a second, 50 mil, ISO 100. And it looks like the focus was done where the subject back here, this is where your focal point is. So of course she's defocused, which is okay. Like, it's a creative thing, that looks fine. What's really getting me is this highlight on her back. Because remember, the brightest parts of an image, that's usually where the eyes will wander. And in this photograph, I bet if I put the highlights on, right, this shows you if any parts of the image are clipping, where the highlights are so bright that they're just pure white pixels. And I was just guessing in my mind, and it turned out to be correct, that this white area on the back, there's actually pixels that are clipping because they're so bright that there's no texture, there's no detail, it's just pure white pixels. And those pure white pixels are going to draw your viewer's eyes. So you have this beautiful subject here. You want to force your viewers to look at that subject, right? You don't want their eyes or their attention to be swayed looking at something else. And in this case, my eyes are swayed towards her back. Now, she's fit and her back it looks strong. So there's nothing, I'm not going to say that it's necessarily wrong, because maybe we're trying to draw attention to the fact that she's got like a really fit back. However, I would venture to guess that maybe that's not the case, because she's in focus, that's defocused. So I would say in this scenario, the one simple thing you could do to fix this photograph and make it a little bit better is just to make sure that you don't have such a hot spot on her back. I mean, that's really it. That's one of the big, like the biggest thing that I think is kind of taking me away from looking at her. Even if you see on her back here, on her lower end here, she has that highlight, but it's not as intense and bright. The other thing too is looking at her face here, I get the whole depth of field and wanting to use the depth of field to really draw the viewer back to your subject. But at f1.4, as you can see on the screen, she's not 100% in focus and sharp. So this is another thing, as you're using these creative compositions, just make sure that she is tack sharp and in focus, because that is going to make the shot significantly better. There was hard light that was being used on this shot, which again, like, I'm a huge fan of kind of doing things out of the ordinary. Most people, because they've heard so many good things about soft light, they're like, oh, let me add some soft light to this. And this photo would have been totally different. It wouldn't have looked, in my opinion, as cool as it does with the lighting that was selected by the photographer. So great job overall, cool concept. Just kind of play around with the lighting. Maybe you might want to feather the light a tiny bit just to make sure that it's not hitting so intensely. Lower the power, back it up a little bit. There's many different options that you can choose to kind of minimize this effect. Let's go to the next photograph here. This photo, it doesn't have any EXIF data, so we don't know exactly what the settings are, but man, that's really, really cool. Cool colors that were chosen. The color palette of the photograph is really interesting. I'm not going to comment on the watermark. You already know how I feel about that. But looking at the photograph, beautiful hair, beautiful model. Her expression is fantastic. She's creating those triangles that we were talking about with that other photo. Looks great. There's a little tiny bit of a tilt, like a Dutch tilt to the photograph. If you see the back of the couch, it's not perfectly level. In this case, it's not terrible. Sometimes when there's too much of a Dutch tilt, it almost looks like the person's just gonna fall out of the frame. She doesn't have that going on, which is good. There is something with the post-processing though. I'm just gonna zoom in. All right, it looks like the file is kind of like a low-res file, so I'm not gonna comment too much on that. You're gonna have to take a look at the raw file that you actually have on your computer to see if I'm accurate. But it looks like there's just like a lot of processing on the skin. And again, this could just be because of the resolution of the file that was submitted. There's almost like there's some kind of ghosting that's happening along the edges of the skin. So, you know, again, it's hard to critique this. Hopefully that's not the case in the actual file, but I would just double check that. Other than that, I mean, this is a really, really nice portrait. It looks like it's got like an interesting post-production retouch that's happening to it. I would maybe just make sure that in a photograph like this, unless you're going for that kind of fantasy type of look, again, just based off of the low res, maybe dial back the retouching a little bit, because this is a shot that I think would really benefit from having some skin texture and some reality to the photograph. It's just a really beautiful model, beautiful, just beautiful shot. The other thing too is maybe there's a vignette that's either being added in post, or maybe it's happening because of the light on your subject. So just look out for the vignetting. It's a little heavier here on the top right corner of the photograph than it is here. So I'm venturing to guess that it might be maybe the lighting. So maybe I would adjust something like that in post. You can actually go into really any program, but you can go into Lightroom and you can go to the vignette, and you can, well, that's a little too far. Maybe like +8 or 9. Just kind of minimize the amount of the vignette up top, because it is a little too, I feel like it's a little too intense and it's not as balanced. So other than that, I mean, man, great model, great shot, cool wardrobe, cool styling. Photograph this person more. Like she looks like she's gonna have a lot of just great expressions and poses that she can give you, which is gonna lead to some really great photos. And then our last photograph. Don't have the EXIF data, so I don't know the settings. So let's talk about a few things here. So very nice work as far as keeping things simple. Oftentimes when you have dresses like this, there's this kind of need to add a bunch of like little extra things to the shot, whether it be like twinkle lights or distractions in the background, whatever the case might be. Didn't happen here, which is great. It looks like the model makeup was done really nicely. The dress is interesting. The color palette is interesting with the blue skies. So settings wise, I can't really tell. It does look like maybe there's a little bit of stuff that's happening here with the exposure. But we kind of look at this here. So let's kind of zoom in first and foremost, scan around the image here. And the first thing that's kind of jumping out at me is the composition. Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how I can phrase this here for you. The composition on this particular shot, I feel like it needs to be a little bit wider. I'm always a fan of filling the frame with the subject, but I feel like there needs to be a little bit of space here at the bottom of the frame, because you do have the dress kind of bunching up here. I get that in a shot like this, that the goal is to really just draw attention to this like magical flow of the wind just picking up the dress and moving it. But I feel like it's just the composition on this is just off, just the slightest bit. If this thing was to go just the tiniest bit wider, like maybe, yeah, I mean, just taking it out a little bit wider than this, or maybe even dropping the, well, definitely not doing that. Basically just bringing your camera and just bringing it down just a touch, and then just widening the shot. I think it would make for a better composition in this shot. The other thing too is her arm. So the arm that's closest to the camera, she's just kind of just holding it there on her leg. Have her bring that elbow back to make a little bit of a triangle there. Could also add for some interest. And so on these dress tosses, where people are tossing the dress like that and you're snapping the photo to take it, where I'm saying to go back a little bit and kind of make this a wider shot, to me, instead of having the dress kind of go up and then go down, it would have been kind of cool to see the dress spread out a little bit. So that's where if you go a little bit wider, pull the dress out a little farther, throw it up, have the person jump out of the frame and take that shot, I feel like it will make the dress look bigger and it will make it look more epic. Hopefully the wind will pick it up and, you know, bless you with some really amazing movement. You know, in this case, it just kind of, I don't know that the movement of the dress really works to give the effect that one would want to see in this type of a portrait, but it doesn't look bad. And you know, other than that, I would say that it's a really, really nice portrait, great location. This is another thing too, and this one's kind of tricky. I don't hate this, but I have to draw attention to it. It looks like it's a little bit too lit. So what I would say in a scenario like this is you have kind of these clouds that look really dramatic. This might be like an overcast day of some sort. I would maybe take the first exposure, which is your ambient light, and maybe make it a little bit darker, maybe like half a stop darker than what you have here, and then pop her with this same amount of light. The image feels a little flat to me, the way that it's lit. Her exposure and the background exposure, I don't feel like there's enough contrast to really emphasize the model, to emphasize the dress. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm trying to phrase this in a way that whether you're starting out or you're more advanced, that you can kind of take this and implement it. But these are things to look at. You want to make sure that your images, beyond the f-stops that you use, have this depth and this dimensionality. And I think as I'm trying to figure out ways to be able to do that in a shot like this, that's what I would be looking at. You might even consider too, you might have used like a wide angle lens to take this. Maybe consider using like a zoom lens, using like a 70-200 and backing up and then zooming into like, you know, 150, 180 mil and taking the same type of shot, but again, making it to where you have more space in your composition by maybe like, we'll say like 15% more space, more width in the photograph. And I think that you would, you'd be surprised that it will look a little different, but you'll have more room for the dress to kind of spread out and kind of do its thing. So we're at the end. We're done with our critique for today. I hope that you guys, it was a long one. I don't know how long this video has been so far, but it seems like it's a long video. So if you stayed until the end, hit the like button. Let me know in the comment section. I made it to the end. I watched the whole thing from front to back. And who knows, maybe if you guys submit the for future critiques, I'll go through the comments, and if I saw that you watched the whole thing, maybe you might get picked for the next round of critiques. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video today. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. More importantly, join the Improve Your Photography group on Facebook, because over the next few weeks, I'm going to be going back again to ask people to submit photos for critique. If you want to get the opportunity to have my full undivided attention looking at your images, giving you feedback, hopefully giving you some actionable intel that you could take to make your photographs better. That's really the goal of doing this type of tutorial. So definitely check that out. And again, Dramatic Portraiture 101 on sale, limited time, 89 bucks. If you want to learn how I shoot what I shoot, how I retouch, just what my brain process is for creating my portraits, definitely check that out. So thanks again for watching the video today, and I will see you in the next one.